Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Ayla Ellison with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll be answering audience questions throughout the presentation today. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled enter a question for staff and clicking send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. Michael Trilly is a senior analyst with research firm IT Group specializing in healthcare. Mike is a certified Six Sigma Green Belt. Mark Archer is a co-founder of Noggin Techs, a company formed to improve healthcare provider cash flow. Mark was inspired to improve patient engagement from his time running a family medical business for 30 years. He brings the collections experience of being Chief Operating Officer of Standard Chartered Bank. Steve Kramer serves as Vice President of Product Management at ACI Worldwide, where he leads the strategy to increase patient revenue. Steve has served as a Vice President of Product Management and Strategy at major players in the payments market for the past 16 years. Steve enjoys being outside, whether playing tennis, softball, or scuba diving. Before we begin, I want to thank today's webinar sponsor, ACI Worldwide. ACI Worldwide enables you to increase patient revenue by 27%. ACI uses predictive analytics and machine learning to improve your patient engagement and revenue. 3 of the top 5 healthcare companies in the U.S. partner with ACI. Additionally, you can join the conversation on Twitter during today's session. Tweet your perspective on each of the topics and see exclusive survey results. During today's webinar, we will discuss the future of patient financial engagement and the results of predictive analytics and machine learning that have increased patient collections. At the end of today's webinar, you will see 3 easy steps to get started and how to customize the ROI to your organization. Mike, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Ayla, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For this piece of the presentation, I will discuss 3 areas. The first, I will strip down how I view the major force driving the financial threat that is tied to patient receivables. Secondly, I'll show how that force is shaping a very different operational model for healthcare providers to manage and collect patient receivables. And then finally, I'll conclude and I'll provide examples of how organizations can think about mitigating some of that threat as they think about how bills and payments can drive not only financial engagement, better collections, but also think about it as an accretive activity to broader patient engagement approaches. And so before I go to the next slide, the force that I'm talking about is health plans. And the threat is to provider organizations who are seeing an increase in the number of their patient populations with high deductible health plans, and that are still relying on a pay and chase collection model as this patient population increases. So as we go to the next slide, this is really an overview of some of the data that I'll present on the subsequent slides. And this figure is really meant to provide a simplistic, but I believe powerful foundational view of the market dynamics impacting the patient, who I'm going to refer to as the consumer throughout, which is on the left-hand side of this figure, and then the healthcare provider, which is your organizations. So we're going to take a top-down approach to this figure. And as we look at the top bar, quite simplistically, more consumers are enrolled in high-deductible health plans. And these enrollment activities are taking place through their employer or through public exchanges or even directly to health plans. But this increase is causing a dramatic change to personal financial models as more consumers take on an increased financial obligation. And in parallel, this changes the provider revenue models as patient balances increase and we look at the dynamics of reimbursements versus collecting directly from patients as a payer. So as we move down to the middle, by default of this enrollment trend, more consumers are paying medical bills to healthcare providers. And so I'd like to qualify the term medical bill, and that is really the post-adjudicated amount a consumer would owe, and not a copayment. So as more consumers pay medical bills, they are naturally going to bring in experiences from other markets in which they also pay bills. And so those experiences will largely be based on how easy it is to pay, But as a result, this easiness, and as a result, providers will find their organizations competing for a share of the consumer's bill payment wallet. And we'll get into what that means in a figure. And finally, the last point, as we look at the bottom row, it really summarizes the change of the personal financial models, and that is most consumers are going to need help paying a larger bill as they think about payment toward those deductibles. And so healthcare providers who are competing for that share of wallet really need to rethink patient touch points to design an experience around the end goal of expanding options to allow patients to pay these bills and naturally to collect as their business revenue models change. So let's go into the next slide, which looks at changes to providers' patient populations. And really, simply, this is the increase in the number of consumers enrolled in high deductible health plans. And I find this chart is a great barometer that Kaiser puts out on an annual basis in their survey of employer health benefits. And the reason I think it's a great barometer is because the employer market still dominates the privately insured marketplace. And so despite what we hear about the Affordable Care Act and the subsequent discussions in Washington today, the individual and the small business market are still an emerging marketplace. So as we look at fundamentally what are the changes to health plan designs, I always go to the employer market. And this trend here shows the blue bar, which is the percentage of covered workers in a high deductible health plan, is really accelerating over the past 2 years. And so as high deductible health plan enrollment market share increases, it has taken enrollment market share away from the yellow bar, which are preferred provider organizations. And there's a lot of different nuances that I won't get into the plan designs, but when I think of that purely from a patient receivables perspective, the environment is moving from a co-payment type of environment to a medical bill payment environment. And that's a drastic change in terms of point of service versus pre-service or post-service. And the last point I'll make on this slide is I also do cover the employer benefits market. And I can assure you what we see in 2015 and 16 is not a flash in the pan trend. So in other words, more employers are continuing to move to these plan designs, and it's a way to spread costs more equitably across in providing the healthcare benefits. So this is a trend that is going to continue to escalate as we move forward in years. So the next slide is really just a depiction as more consumers are enrolled in these high deductible health plans. Means more consumers are paying out of their own pocket. And as a result, the total amount of dollars that consumers are paying to healthcare businesses is increasing. And by my estimates, it's expected to reach $515 billion by 2019. The blue boxes show how much more consumers will be spending each year. So for example, in 2019, consumers will be paying an additional $38 billion out of their pockets. So what I would like to point out that is not shown on this screen, but discuss this a little bit, which is more germane to our audience and discussion here, is roughly 50% of that $515 billion is what consumers will pay to healthcare providers such as hospitals and clinics and other providers. So as I pointed out on the last slide, the nature of these payments will be oriented toward bill payments and not co-payments. And this shift requires provider organizations to consider two areas that impact their collection strategy as this trend continues to move forward. So the first consideration is on the next slide, and it's really how are you as a business going to get your bill prioritized in a consumer's bill payment wallet? So as this figure shows, medical bills are now the 13th most frequent bill a consumer pays, as you can see out of, and this shows top 15, but out of 29 very common categories. So I'm a consumer and I have a high deductible health plan. So I want to give a simple example of how I, as an average consumer, bring in other experiences and really understanding what is easy for me. And certainly everyone on this phone can all do that as we look up and down that list based on our own experiences. But the example I'm going to use is auto insurance, and that's the fourth most popular bill from the top of the slide. So I pay for 2 cars, same insurer, different billing cycles for the 6-month premiums. So one of the premiums is in the $600 range. But when I receive that bill, I have options on how I want to pay that bill. Do I want to pay that all at once, every month, every 3 months? So when I compare that flexibility and options to the last medical bill that I paid in the similar amount range, I had one option, pay in full. So the second point I want to make is I also have home insurance and an addendum to my home insurance from the same insurer, but I never get a single consolidated bill from them for all of those different expenses I owe. I sure would like to see my auto insurer present all those items to me on a single itemized statement and allow me to pay over a fixed monthly amount. So I point out those two examples for a simple reason. It was just simply about giving different options to pay one time or over time. And I am not alone, and I think the key as we think about where this market is moving is how do healthcare provider organizations understand and meet consumer preferences, and in doing so create an easier experience. So the next consideration is really around, and I'll articulate this consideration summarizing MGMA's findings, which I also find they do a good job of keeping a pulse on receivables operations. And these three bullets tie into my assertion that continuing down a pay and chase strategy is really just not sustainable for businesses against the backdrop of what we just discussed. So for example, on the first bullet there, 30% of patients walk out of the door without paying anything. And certainly we can all make guesses as to why, and not all of them are contributing factors to the dynamics that I'm talking about today. They may not owe anything, but as we have seen, the population of people in that camp of not owing anything at the point of service is decreasing as we get into the high deductible world. But it could also, another reason could be healthcare providers did not know the costs, therefore a patient cannot pay. But as we think about where the market is now, there are products and more importantly workflows to solve for that today. But so as we think about that 30% of patients walking out the provider door, we think about an increase in consumers in high deductibles, that number cannot go up. Second bullet I'd like to talk about is patients average 3.3 billing statements before paying. So we just think about the previous slide I talked about. Can you think of any other bill payment market that would do that? So for example, does your utility provider send you 3.3 bills before paying? And finally, the likelihood to collect at the collection agency diminishes greatly, and adopting a proactive approach can mitigate some of that risk. So I'd like to go to the next. Yes.
Hey, Mike, it's Steve Kramer. Just wanted to chime in for a minute. So your point about the 3.3 bills is really a great point. The other thing I think people need to consider, as you mentioned, is healthcare turns much more into a bill pay centric thought process, or needs to be. Consumers, when you saw that list of bills, are prioritizing their bills. And if you ask consumers, that's exactly what they say they're going to do, right? Let me pay the first one off the top of my head. Oh, gotta have the power on, I'll pay the electricity. But as you said, they'll also pay based on the ease, or can I afford it, or is there a plan in place? So they're absolutely prioritizing it, and that's probably why it's taking 3.3 for them to collect here.
Thank you, Steve. Great point. And it's a great segue into our next slide. And I know there are a few different approaches out there, and HIMSS and their Revenue Cycle Task Force and HFMA have engagement models, and I highly encourage anyone who has not seen them to take a look because they're very well thought out. And what we're seeing on this particular slide is my view of the new engagement model, and it is one that I developed initially back in 2013 as this whole notion of these price transparency solutions started to come to market. And while much of the focus, and rightly so, was on the value that these solutions were creating in terms of a front-end shopping experience, I guess it really appealed to it tapped into the industrial engineer in me that I haven't used in a while, but I was equally fascinated on the impact to the revenue cycle in terms of extending the patient receivables process from what was really kind of ingrained at the point of service to this new sort of extending into this virtual self-service or even pre-service capacity. And so as we fast forward to this year, I've added a few capabilities here, and Mark is going to do an excellent job on really kind of diving into some of the analytics. So I'm not going to go through this kind of item by item, but I just want to share a couple of key highlights. And I think the first one is really just kind of echoing what Steve just said. And I think fundamentally it's turning a one-time payment event into a recurring one, but that whole initiative starts at the time an appointment is scheduled or at the time an appointment is made. I think the second characterization of this model is it's really personalized and digital, right? So from a provider organization's perspective, it's lower cost, it's driving self-service, and ultimately you're giving your consumers/patients options just like my auto insurer did for me. Third, and this is really where the challenge comes in and the complexity, is the point of service goal has changed from collecting a copayment to really engaging in a different type of conversation and collecting a commitment to pay. And then finally, if you look at post-service, it's really unlocking or unleashing a digital post-service billing process. And that process is familiar, it's easy, it's consolidated, as I discussed, that I wish my auto insurer had. And ultimately, it's cost-effective, more cost-effective for the provider, as you don't have to send those 3.3 bills. It's underpinned, the workflow is underpinned with a level of analytic sophistication, and from what I've seen, almost an elegance needed for providers and patients to have these engagements, right? As more patients have direct payment relations with providers, it's really using the analytics through estimation and propensity to pay to fulfill that payment obligation. And I think last, but not least, it's using analytics to drive scripting. So recognizing, as I said on the earlier slide, this is a learning curve for not only the consumers, but the providers, and having the sophistication in these systems that provide scripting. It's really personalized on Mike Trilly. He's in a high deductible health plan. He has an HSA, and tailoring a script. And I think those are sort of the key attributes of this system. So I'd like to take a pause here and introduce our first poll question. And that question is, how do you determine, and so if you can make the choice in your bar, and we will present the results, but how do you determine how much a patient can pay? And please select all the answers that apply. Does your staff talk with the patient? Does your staff review patient tax returns? Do you have a propensity to pay technology with credit bureau data? Do you use predictive analytics based on your patient data? And you have machine learning based on your patient data. So please select all that apply. And we will provide the results here. So great, your staff interacts with the patient. And we're seeing some more use, higher than I expected, use of analytics and technology. So fantastic. So I'd like to conclude my part, and thank you for participating in that poll. I'd like to conclude my piece with 2 slides outlining examples of how organizations can think about bills and payments to drive the behaviors that you're looking to drive, whether that's engagement, whether that's collections. And this particular slide demonstrates how bills and payments can drive consumers to portals, and how healthcare, as we think about this idea again of going from a one-time payments market toward a recurring one, gives consumers or patients a repeated reason to visit your websites and your mobile apps. So on the left, it breaks out where consumers would go to look up their digital bill. So in effect, these are your patients who receive an electronic bill from their hospital or healthcare provider. And the dark blue piece of the pie shows that 32% of consumers from this survey, which represent just under 2,000 bills, will go to their provider's website. And the figure on the right shows through which channels then consumers will pay their bills. So if we think about all the dollars that consumers are paying healthcare providers, 32% of the money is being transacted through the mail channel, and 29% of that money is being paid through a provider's website. So again, bills and payments are digital engagement levers. And the next example sort of takes this concept, notion one step further. So as we saw, as I just discussed, mail is the leading channel consumers use to pay their bills. But the figure on the left depicts this may not have to be the case. So what the figure on the left shows is on the top bar, those consumers who receive a electronic bill, what channels they use to pay. The bar in the middle is those that receive both a paper and electronic bill. And then on the bottom, those consumers that receive a paper bill, what channels they use. So if you focus on the blue bar at the end of each row, and then the yellow bar that I've circled, that's the percentage between mail and online. And so very simply, but again, I think pretty profoundly depicted through data, if you go to the top row there, those individuals that receive an electronic bill are going to more likely pay through your website. As you go down, that percentage decreases from receiving a paper bill. And here on the right oh, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry about that. And a really good point, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit for what you're about to show on the right. But again, back to that earlier slide with all of the bills that consumers are prioritizing, right? You look at who gets electronic bills today, and when you look at some of those top billers, you know, their percentage of electronic bill presentment tends to be much higher than we tend to see in this space, and hence digital payments follow along suit, as you just showed.
Excellent point. And I think my final point before I turn it off to Mark, or back to Ayla, excuse me, is the figure on the right really illustrates that opportunity, right? Paper billing dominates this market, but as we see on the left and we saw on the previous slide, it doesn't have to be that way if you understand the preferences of your patient populations, and those that want to receive digital bills will transact digitally. So with that, I'll turn it to Ayla, back to Ayla to answer a couple of questions if anyone has any.
Great, thank you, Mike. And we've had a few questions come in from audience members during your part of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and start in with those. And the first question is, 16%, how does that compare with the percentage that hospitals are receiving from insurance companies? Why not discount on the front end and get the 16% earlier?
And so I think that's a great question. So I don't have the analysis at hand that shows, you know, what that comparison is from the insurance companies, but I think the question raises an excellent point, and I think Mark's going to touch on this in a little bit more detailed manner. But I think when, you know, the term payment options and payment arrangements is a very broad term, and so I think ultimately what these systems are looking to do is create a way for organizations to execute their financial policies. And if part of that policy is to enable a discount at the point, you know, earlier in the process, then that is certainly a way to think about collecting that receivable.
Thank you, Mike. And we have one more question that came in, and it is, for large systems, we tend to have a large out-of-pocket expense for our patients. What is the best class model for managing long-term payment plans?
And I see Tony Murray, thank you for asking that. You know, when I think of what's the best class model, you know, I think, again, I'm going to go back to before we think about what the payment vehicle or facility is, it's understanding a little bit more about what the patient's ability to pay is. And I think it's really kind of fundamentally the way I see the market kind of shaping up. It's the ability to offer a variety of products on a variety of terms that ultimately cater to meeting your receivable sort of timeline, as well as, more importantly, I think in terms of this environment that we're heading, is trying to collect as much of that balance in full. So when I think about best class model, you know, I think there's a lot of different patient financing and options out there now that are very patient centric. And I would say it's really up to your organization in terms of the type of kind of recourse versus non-recourse model that you'd like to, you know, that works for your organization.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. And now we can move on to the next part of the presentation, and it will be Mark presenting from here.
Hey, thanks, Ella. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Hey, if you guys have any questions, please pass them along, and we can, you know, hopefully have some time at the end to, you know, to deal with as many as we can. First off, when we think about the patient payer, it's helpful to look across. If we could go to the next screen, please. There we go. So again, like I said, first off, when we think about the patient payer, it's helpful to look across the entire patient account life cycle, from the appointment to the payment. Our core message here is knowing how, when, and what to communicate will drive a positive change in your patient's behavior. There are several best practices on the slide, not the least of which is communicating with your patient using multiple digital channels, SMS, email, e-voice, and web portals. Studies have shown that your payer response rate could be 25% higher simply by communicating with your patient as they prefer. And many patients, including some on this call, prefer the privacy of electronic channels. And we appreciate websites with simplified billing and easy to understand payment plans tailored to our needs and likes. Generally, when to communicate is as early as practical. Pre-appointment communications for new patients can be very effective because you have the high ground, assuming your systems can determine with confidence what will be owed. Pre-appointment communications are also a very opportune time to communicate balances owed for previously provided services. Many patients would prefer to set up payments through a website if it's convenient and pain-free, as opposed to having that in-office conversation. So as I move on the slide a little bit, after the claim has been adjudicated and the remaining personal responsibility has been determined, it's very important to get a bill out immediately. This is much easier today with e-bill functionality, which also may avoid a significant amount of printing and mailing expense. Recall from Mike's comments a little earlier that you are competing for the consumer's disposable income, and it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much to go around. So communicating early and seamlessly is really very critical to success. Following up with emails, SMS, e-voices is really an easy and unobtrusive way to get your patient focused on their obligation and really help get them engaged on a solution. So I spent a fair amount of time talking about the best-in-breed practices for how and when to communicate, but I think that's just the beginning. Propensity to pay modeling will turbocharge your results by enabling the most effective combinations of how and when, but more importantly, by answering the questions of what to say. So can we back up a slide or two, guys, if you don't mind? I'm sorry, I must have miscued for you, but back up one more. Okay, so I'm just about to talk here kind of more about the segmentation piece. So knowing prices, so propensity to pay modeling will turbocharge your results, like I said, by enabling the most effective combination of how and when, but more importantly, by answering the question of what to say. Knowing precisely what to communicate to change non-payers into payers is a combination of art and science. Sub-segmenting your patient population by propensity to pay and other predictive variables improves your chances of capturing that elusive payment through fine-tuning of the message or payment offer. And with good reporting on the performance of those sub-segments, it will also make it obvious what to do next if at first you don't succeed. So in a couple of slides, not right now, but in a couple of slides, I'm going to talk a lot more and you kind of dive deeper into what does a propensity to pay model look like, what does segmentation look like, how do you use the e-channels. So if you don't mind, why don't we just jump ahead and I'll go into propensity to pay then. Next slide, please. So a propensity to pay model quite simply just calculates the odds your patient will repay. We'll spend a moment on the graph if you don't mind. This is real client data used in a propensity to pay score development project. Just some definitions for you. A bad is someone who hasn't paid within 60 days, and a good is someone who has. Pretty simple. In this particular population that we work with, there were 7 bads for 3 goods before we applied any kind of collection strategy or communication strategy against them. This is probably a pretty good representative of what you are facing. I wouldn't be too surprised if the odds are the same, 7 bads, 3 goods, or something very close. As a best practice, you would want a model that is based on how your patient payers perform with you, a medical service creditor, as opposed to how they pay their other liabilities, as might be reflected in a bureau score. This is not to say that credit bureau scores can't be effective, but they are generally more expensive and probably have less utility and power than one built on how your patient pays you, the medical service creditor. What I mean by the power of the propensity to pay score is the ability to separate the goods from the bads. You look at that graph, what we want to do is get those two populations, the mean of those two populations, as far apart as possible. What I mean by utility is the more separation we get, goods from bads, the more precise we can be in sending targeted requests and offers that lead to true incremental payments. When you can't tell the goods from the bads, meaning there is a lot of overlap of the curves, or you don't have a propensity to pay model, patient response rates for all your collection efforts tend to be pretty low. And what usually happens is creditors resort to kind of a buckshot approach, that probably gives away something you were going to get anyway in terms of additional costs and maybe lost balances. A propensity to pay model should be built on how the patient pays you across a range of variables. The repayment odds by variable or clusters of variables are combined into a score using statistical model techniques. The model output is used to force rank your patients from more to less likely to pay. Variables such as balance due, demographics, past payment behavior, time as a patient, etc., are all considered. The model will be only as good as the data it's built on, so it's critical to have clean data with well-defined and stable elements over reasonable and multiple observation windows. Absent clean data, it's sometimes best to train a pre-existing propensity to pay model to your patient base, at least until data issues can be addressed or enough data has been accumulated to build your own model. Once you have your model, now it's time to think about what actions we can take. So if you don't mind, let's look at the next slide. As we said, a propensity to pay model is the strong foundation of any analytics-based approach to improving patient engagement and collecting incremental payments. This slide is laid out to help you think about using the information your new tool provides. The slide is a somewhat simplified but still a very powerful illustration of subsegmentation and the strategies that can be employed on each subgroup. The objective of the strategies is to get your patient to your site to pay or sign up for a payment plan. When thinking about your patients, it's useful to look across two dimensions. Are they willing to pay, and are they able to pay? The answers to those two questions will subset your population to 4 groups. In our company, we let the data do the talking, but we labeled them here because a label immediately calls to your mind some possible strategies for working with each group. Let's call them forgetful, struggling, entitled, and problem. Most of the labels should be clear to you, but I'd like to explain the entitled group. These are the patients who may resent, for a whole host of reasons, having to pay anything more than their insurance premium and their copay here and there. As you might expect, a lot of benefit will flow from cracking the collection strategy code on this group. The overarching idea is to find the right message, tone, send it through the best channel at the right frequency with a compelling reason or offer at the right time. We should first recognize, however, that all patients must be treated with the respect you or I would expect. We tend to default to a pull strategy, a compelling offer, creative spin on why one should pay, as opposed to a push strategy, which is how most people are used to being treated by their creditors. There is a time and a place to employ a push strategy, but believe it isn't often at the starting line, which is probably contrary to how many medical collection agencies might view the patient world. For a patient who's a bit forgetful, but we are confident will pay, an e-bill and a light reminder to their email account sent the first week might be enough to spur payment. If they don't respond, we will expand the channels we use to communicate, adding SMS and e-voice, send more frequent messages, alter the tone, and maybe add a small reward for responding. If they still don't respond, and absent a good reason why not, you will want to become more assertive and varied in your approach. Continued attempts at contact is the key to bringing these payments home. On the opposite end of the spectrum are the problem patients that have real financial concerns and will need a different approach. For this subsegment, we find messaging them early with a compelling offer can change their willingness to pay. Further, we find we can frequently land them on a plan everybody can live with. An important point to make here is that you want to test into the offers and messages, meaning you want to objectively satisfy yourself that the improvements in response rates are offsetting anything you give away or spend to get the money back. To accomplish this, we use A/B or champion challenger testing. What we mean by A/B testing is first holding out, on a random basis, a statistically valid piece of the subpopulation that continues with the business as usual approach. The BAU group then becomes the baseline against which you measure the effectiveness of your new strategies. We call the BAU approach the champion, and we set out to beat it with a challenger strategy. Let's think a minute and look at how to create some incremental payments, how to beat the BAU, the champion. Consider this question. Out of a known segment of 100 problem patients, you segmented down to these 100 patients. They all have a $400 balance. They're all 60 days past due. They're all statistically the same guys. Would you rather have 10 of the $100? Would you rather have 10 of these 100 people pay the $400 balance to a collection agency where the fee is maybe 30, 35, 40% 6 months down the road? Or would you rather have 25 people out of the 100 pay 6 payments of $50, a total of $300, yeah, a $100 haircut, with the first $50 payment made today? So again, would you rather have 10 guys pay you $400 6 months from now, or would you rather have out of the same group 25 that pay you $300 broken into 6 payments, but the first payment starts today? The premise of the hypothesis is that the offer will spur 15 people to pay what would not have been paid, maybe ever. In this example, it's important to recall that the people we're talking about are statistically the same population, and they will behave exactly the same unless you do something to let them or help them perform differently. So the net present value of the future cash stream of the 25 people paying you $300 in 6 installments is more than double, almost triple, what would you get from 10 patients paying the full $400 after expenses to the collection agency. The NPVs of the 2 strategies are about $7,200 for the 25 versus about $2,500 for the 10. Not every example is clear-cut, but there are a lot of questions you can ask like that. You can find these pockets of opportunities, match the right plan, match the right message to that pocket, and get very similar results. So the hypothetical question we just posed is how to approach your sub-segment and its critical component to creating the payment lift we just saw. So a best practice is to continually test into these new questions, building on what you know and continuing to improve payment outcomes. That's where machine learning, another best practice, can guide and accelerate the development of more and better strategies for sub-segmenting and treating your populations. Hopefully, the illustration we just walked through has shown how a good propensity to pay model and a well-reasoned and tested strategy over and above just sending out a bunch of repayment request messages will produce incremental payments for the organization. Before we look at how to deploy these new tools, we have a few poll questions to stimulate your thinking. So
hey, Mark, before your poll question, I think that last slide was really informative. Someone in the last section asked the question about best-in-class, like payment plan type approaches. And I think you really well encapsulated there what is involved in a best-in-class, which really is that flexibility and be able to reach consumers where they need to be reached and where it's appropriate to reach them. I thought that was a great way to almost answer the questions in the last section.
Yeah, I think they dovetail nicely, yeah. And it's not only, it's the right time, right place, right frequency, right message, really trying to figure out, what makes your patient tick when it comes to paying their bills. I think Mike touched on that also. So, thank you, Steve. The poll question that's up is, when your staff talks to a patient, which one of these do they change based on patient ability to pay? Select all that apply. So if we could, take a few minutes and try and answer that. Okay. So I think the results are pretty clear. It's time period to pay. So actually just trying to, kind of push it out a little bit, and that makes perfect sense. That's good. Thank you. Let me jump on to kind of the deployment. I think we had the deployment screen up. Do we have another poll question, or do we want to move on to deployment? Sorry, Ayla.
Looks like we've got one more poll question here.
Okay. So when a patient comes to your website, which of these does your website change based on the patient's ability to pay? So tone of voice, time period to pay, amount to pay. And there we go. So the time period to pay, again, 62%. So you're varying that up and down to trying to fit, into the patient's budget, which is, a good practice. Let's talk a little bit about deployment. When thinking about how to deploy the models I just talked about on the analytic-driven segmentation and offers and digital communication platforms, it's best to use a measured and disciplined approach. Regarding your collection strategy, start with things that have the lowest level of effort but have good impact. Our best practice is start first with building communication channel functionality. So that's the first kind of light green band there, starting with the oranges is what you get today, moving out, expanding the universe as you capture more and more payments. So our best practice is to start first with building communication channel functionality, simply adding channels like SMS, email, e-voice, IVR, web portals, and getting into a regular rhythm of communication, communicating important messages to your patients before and after an appointment will reward you with incremental payments. I know you've heard that before, but starting here is a relatively easy win, and the success it brings builds confidence and organization buy-in and support for the next steps. The diagram shows the next step is to begin varying messages, tone, and frequency, which requires the first use of your propensity to pay model in conjunction with your first foray into analytic segmentation. This is very dependent on getting the right data elements into your decision engine, so keeping it simple and doing some validation and testing is really the aim of the first 1 or 2 patient collection strategies. It doesn't have to be a perfect strategy right out of the gate. Keeping your test kind of small to start, expecting great things, but don't be disappointed by a little failure. In fact, you will probably learn more about your patient and how to best use your new tools by making a mistake here and there. It's always to ramp up a winning strategy once you find it. Once the tools are in place and there is a good basic understanding of the strategy development process, it's time to get creative. Think about engagement offers next, something as simple as a Starbucks card or a valet parking pass. These things can really move the needle. The next step is deployment of and testing of pay plan offers and haircuts. Taking some money off the top and offering to kind of stretch the payments out. Again, you only want to do this where you know by champion challenger, you know your analytics, you know your testing, you know that you're going to get an incremental response that offsets the money you're giving away and offsetting it by a lot. The very last step might be utilizing live operators to work on unique segments that respond well enough to offset the higher costs. In summary, the software and tools, including A/B champion challenger testing and machine learning, create opportunities to learn your way to success to impressive results. What follows are a couple of examples of what can be accomplished. In the first example, we are showing what a mature deployment will do. It's important to note that the attributes of the populations being compared here are statistically identical. In other words, they have the same average patient age, time on file, average balance. They're statistically the same. You couldn't tell the difference from one to the other, at least based on the variables and the attributes. The other thing I'd like to mention, this is real data. So please look first at the graph on the left. In this real example, the business as usual champion strategy on early stage 1 to 59-day debts was a paper statement at the end of each month, 2 phone attempts a week after the first statement, and every week thereafter, and a paper printout for the front office of appointments that day who owed for previously provided services. The strategy channel was pre and post appointment messaging using electronic communication. Electronic messages were sent with varying tone, frequency, and offerings, and they were adjusted as time went on. A web portal with a simplified bill and payment plan option was also made available for patients. As you can see, the improvement in time to cash and the amount of cash collected was pretty dramatic. The payback for the client was over 20 times every dollar they spent for the tools. So, pretty impressive results. This stuff works. The graph on the right is one I'm particularly happy with. These were 60+ due patient accounts with the same client. These accounts were lower balances, about a $200 average, and many were over 2 years past due, and some had been recalled by the client from collection agencies. This is pretty tough paper. The results again here were dramatic, and the payback was also north of $15 for every dollar spent. The client asked us to quickly move the BAU populations, the ones they, the champion strategy they had been doing for years, to new strategies, which is the ultimate complement. And as you might expect, the staff had more time working on improving billing processes and eliminating errors. These benefits were not quantified or measured, but they're thought to be pretty material. Let's look at another set of results. The results here were very similar to those we just reviewed. However, they are on a slightly different slice of the patient account life cycle. This is the 60 to 120-day window that I'm focusing on here. I think of this period as a firewall between a collected account and a write-off. Once they get past 120, they still might be collectible with your new tools. Of course, you'll get some of it, but the longer the situation persists, the more difficult it is to get good response and payment rates. The BAU champion strategy was, like our first example, paper statements, weekly manual phone attempts, in-office reminders, and an occasional outsource to a collection agency. Again, the results were dramatic, and the payback was, again, north of 15 times the amount spent. It's important to emphasize that these strategies are not one-hit wonders. The results are very predictable and sustainable. The benefit is there month after month. So hopefully you're wondering what kind of impact might you expect. We can jump to the impact page. Let's talk a bit about the impact to a large hospital system. The BAU champion data on this slide is real data from a system that does considerably over $1 billion in annual revenue. The chart to the left helps us follow the money. In the first 30 days, they collect about 11% of patient responsibility money billed out that month. At day 60, they have collected about 12% of what was left over from the previous month's 30s, and so on down the line to 180 and a write-off. It's just a waterfall. The amount that's left over is the chart on the right. About 38% of patient money is getting collected and 62% flows to loss over 180 days. That's quite a drain on your revenue, quite a drain on your profitability, and an issue obviously everybody's facing. The hospital system used internal and external collection personnel and offers hardship programs and financing options at a later stage on a selected basis, and also utilize Bureau Score to help them make that decision. The Challenger strategy is an estimate built on the overlay of best-in-breed tools and practices. Of course, it takes time and investment to do this, but the results are again dramatic. The flow to loss is expected to drop to 53%, meaning an incremental 10% was collected, which is a conservative 16% improvement. You can see on the graph to the left where the technology really kicks in. Looking at another way, if the revenue was $1 billion and 12% of that was self-pay after insurance, $120 million, the improvement in cash collected is 10% of $120 million, which is $12 million. That's real money. There are also other benefits to this approach, including a more satisfied patient-payer base and lower operating expenses. So these are challenging and exciting times to be on the front line of the new patient-payer reality. I hope I've conveyed how predictive models and analytic tools, coupled with intelligent communication technology, can help make a difference in how your patients think about and pay their obligations for medical services. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our learnings. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Ayla to take a few questions, if I could, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And we'll go ahead and jump in with the first question here. And it is, so with the Equifax breach, consumer financial gurus are recommending that consumers freeze their credit. How is a larger population with frozen credit going to impact using credit scoring?
Well, what we're suggesting here as a best practice is actually building your propensity to pay model off of your own data. So, you know, using how everybody pays everybody else as you get in a credit bureau, you know, it's not really necessary. If you've got good payment data and, you know, you've got a big enough population and you've got a powerful enough score on your own, you don't really need it. You don't need that bureau score. It's great if you can have it, and it, you know, the score will be impacted, I think, at least temporarily by what's going on with people freezing and so on and so forth. But, you know, we think the real lift comes out of having you know, a model score that's built really on how your patient pays and not how they pay everybody else.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And now we're going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Steve Kramer. And Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ayla. And thanks, Mike and Mark. Great data. Really, really interesting. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through my section because we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we leave at least some time available for people on the WebEx to be able to ask questions, because that's actually usually the more interesting thing than hearing me speak, is hearing your questions. But trying to bring this home, in doing surveys, what do people want in terms of bills? And no surprise probably to anybody on this call, 88% of people want easier to read healthcare bills. And this becomes really dramatic as you think about the slide that Mike showed earlier, the prioritization of bills and what people are looking to pay and how they decide what they're going to pay and when they're going to pay it. And if you think about and compare your healthcare bills with, let's say, your cable bill, right? Generally, if you don't look at all the taxes and fees they add, right? But generally, when you look at a cable bill, it's pretty straightforward. It's my monthly bill. I'm paying X dollars per month. I'm ready to go. It's very easy. It's very straightforward. But with healthcare bills, it tends to be much more complicated. How much do I really owe? How much has been paid? How much am I willing to pay? Is there a plan available? There are all kinds of challenges that healthcare bills give you that those other bills don't. So when consumers are looking and saying, which bill am I going to pay and in what order, that's another reason why healthcare bills are very often not as prioritized as highly as some of those others. We jump to the next slide. So what do patients want? Well, as we say here, they want everything, of course. But what they really want is that payment experience improved. What kind of options do I have in there? And a lot of these that you're looking at here are fairly straightforward in what people have been talking about for many years, right? Convenient payment options, right? Are you hitting me where I live? Somebody who's a millennial, are you making sure that what you're giving them is something that's going to be available on their mobile phone? Because that's where they're living their life, right? That's probably their primary internet device. Are you giving multiple funding options? I thought Mark did a great job there of talking about the flexibility in terms of propensities to pay and how things are working and how are you approaching the consumers and what kind of funding options they have. People have life changes, and even if somebody's in one bucket today, tomorrow they may be in a different bucket and need a different way, a different funding option, or a different payment plan, third option there, right? What is the way they're working? How are you going to get it so that bill, that medical bill, doesn't drop to the bottom of the pile? But there's ways I can go, I can't pay all that today. Oh, there's a payment plan available for me. So I can actually sign up for that. I can make it easy. It's where I live. They've reached out to me in the appropriate way. And now I can make those payments the way I want to be made. And I'm more in control of my finances as a patient, as a consumer. Let's go to the next slide. But, those are the things we've been talking about in the past, right? Give me more channels. Give me more ways to pay. Make sure you're reaching me where I live, right? Make sure I have funding available. But boy, these other things are critical. Somebody, mentioned the Equifax breach. I mean, you hate to say it, right? But now consumers are going to be more and more concerned with security, which is a good thing. But you need to make sure you're communicating with them in those secure fashions and in a way that they understand that you're taking the security seriously. We don't want consumers to be more gun shy, and they're going to be much more aware of this. The speed. If I make that payment, is it applied right away? Is it connecting directly to the ERP system at the back end so that as a consumer, I know I made that payment and I see my balance change and I know, good, I'm done. I don't have to think about that anymore. And that ties right into that third one, immediate payment confirmations, right? I've made that payment and I get something back from you. I don't know whether it's an email, whether it's a text, something in real time that says to me, I know my payment's been made. I know I'm in good shape now. Good. That's one less worry for me. So again, when I'm prioritizing those bills and trying to decide what I'm paying of all those monthly bills, this is secure, it's easy, and I know it gets paid. So now I have a reason to prioritize that bill and go in and put my limited dollars towards that bill. Next slide. So how does this all add up, right? How do you get down to? Because obviously putting in any new system, right, there's always going to be a cost to it, but what's the benefit of it? And Mark just did a phenomenal job of showing you those results, right? And those real world results of I was able to lower my net flow to loss, and boy, look at what the results were there. And so we've actually can work through with you and show you how to generate an ROI for that of saying, look, based on the revenue and based on what that industry average is, what could I do? And what could I drop my net flow to loss down to? And you can see here on the slide just an example of how you can do this, right? Based on these couple of inputs and a couple more questions, very easily turn around and show you what that incremental dollars collected could be. And once you start seeing that, boy, the ROI on that becomes very easy and very simple to put together. So, there are ways to put these ROIs together. We're about to put a poll up on the screen. If you're interested in having assistance in putting together that ROI, just let us know. What would you like for a customized ROI, and how soon would you like to have one put together? And we can work with you and show you what you can do to get your personal customized ROI and see, like, okay, now I get it, right? Now I see exactly how this fits together. So we'll give it just a moment. We won't be showing these results up on the screen, so don't worry about your data is secure here, right? I talked about security before. But please feel free to vote for what you would like to do in terms of getting that customized ROI. Okay, so I think that, as I said, I wanted to go very quickly through my section. The big call here, though, is the status quo just isn't an option anymore, right? Mike said it really well early on. Patient and bill, patient payments are, you have to start thinking them as a bill payment. It's not just patients communicating and working directly with you. This is now a bill. And you need to start thinking about it. Are you reaching the consumer where they live? Are you giving them the options they need? Are you reaching them the appropriate way and offering them ways to pay that they don't have today to drive additional payments and to drive that higher interaction, so that the next time we do those surveys, right, we see the medical bills higher up on that list and not 12 to 13 on that list. And that's where I wanted to end. I wanted to do it very quickly because I just wanted to give you guys a chance to ask us questions as well. So I believe that's the next slide is questions. I think we have a couple of minutes left.
Great. Yes, we do have several questions that have come in from our audience members today. So I'll go ahead and jump in with some of those. And the first question is, so do electronic statements result in more payments collected and faster payments collected?
Well, I could jump on that one for you quickly. So in terms of more payments collected, that's a harder question to ask because it's hard to benchmark that. I mean, generally, what we've often seen here at ACI is the more channels you have and the more channels where you can reach consumers, the more likely they are to pay. And the more electronic channels you have, as Mike showed earlier, the more likely it is for that to be an electronic payment in. And just as one data point to think about. And this is a little bit old data, and I apologize for that. But there was a study done several years ago that said how quickly do consumers interact based on ways you reach them. And if it was in the mail, you sent them a statement, you're usually going to get a consumer interaction within 5 to 7 days at best. If it was via email, it was usually within like 24 hours, you're going to get some kind of consumer interaction. And if it was via some mobile channel like text or something like that, it was usually measured within minutes. And if it was my son, the millennial, it would be measured in seconds if it was on a cell phone. So what we can tell you is that that consumer interaction and that electronic consumer action absolutely does drive payments, and it drives speed to payment because the consumer is going to interact with you faster.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And we'll go ahead and jump in with the next question. And the next question is, what is the role of staff training in this process?
Well, this is Mark. I can jump. Oh, go ahead, Mark. It's okay. No, that's okay. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that obviously that role is very, very critical. And I'll just talk about it from my perspective, and Mark, you can kind of dive into the propensity to pay. But I think as you look at the model, right, I mean, the patient engagement model, there are different applications there. And certainly the ability to understand, how those applications work. But I think really the key to kind of that I would take away from all of this is it's not using an application to generate some number or using analytics. They are sophisticated and they are elegant, as I said, but I think really where the staff and the ability to train and ultimately deliver what the output of the analytics is, I think that's really the key role. And so I do think there is a very key role to understand how does this fit, teach workflow and teach communication, and ultimately there is that, because financial conversations, particularly in the patient realm, I think they're becoming more commonplace, but that is still an aptitude and expertise that is developing within particularly the hospital industry. Mark, you can add if you had something particular to your solution.
No, Mike, the only other thing that I could maybe offer is that when you start to work with these tools and technologies and, kind of different approaches that we've talked about here today, it's very important to create kind of a learning environment that it's safe to learn how to use these in your organization and how to use them. Embrace them. It's change. It's difficult. It's never easy. But in this particular instance, it pays big dividends in creating kind of that learning environment as you're using these really helps a lot.
Well, thank you, Mike and Mark. And it looks like we have time for one more question today. And the question is, what about TCPA and auto dialers? Do you feel hospitals are excluded from the use of communication through cell phones for TCPA?
Well, from a compliance standpoint, if you can actually have in your financial policy the ability or the permission to use those particular modes of electronic communication, you're in a much better situation. There is, granted, a little bit, I think some people would argue some gray area about what you can do and not do, but we're very, very careful to be in full compliance and to also, be within the full spirit of that particular set of regulations.
Thank you very much, Mark. That is all the time that we have for today, but I want to once again thank Mike, Mark, and Steve for their excellent presentation and to our audience for participating today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.